Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. In this installment, we're off to see the wizard, the wonderful wizard of Osgir. Osgir the Reconstructor is a dream in red and white. A 4-mana 4/4 with vigilance, he's a sacrifice outlet for our artifacts and can exile them from our graveyard to supply us with 2 token copies of whatever artifact we exile. How many wonders can one cavern lore hold? Let's find out. Osgir's EDHREC page is already filling up insanely fast. This is what happens when Wizards gives us such creative designs in these colors. We're still seeing a handful of cards that are holdovers from the pre-constructed deck though, so let's get this commander's upgrades headed on the right track. We'll go right ahead and get the commander's average deck list from the average deck feature and import it to the Architect deck building website. As always, the swaps we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or help lower the price of the overall deck. Yo, this list is sick. We've got Osgirs, Osscrews, Oscogs, Ospulleys. There are tons of potential targets to double up here that will have tons of powerful potential, from duplicated mana rocks to duplicated powerhouses. I learned very quickly that this deck can make a lot of incidental mana, since we can tap a mana rock, use that mana to pay for Osgir to sacrifice it, then use his ability to make copies of that mana rock right from our graveyard, which even enter untapped. There's never a dull turn with this deck. I love seeing that. Even the little touches from Metalcraft removal spells, and even stuff like Coveted Jewel. Like, this usually seems like a pretty dangerous card to include in a commander deck, but if someone's gonna try and steal it, or any copies of it that we make, they supply their own mana for Osgir to just sacrifice them straight away. Then there's my favorite card in the list, Karn the Great Creator, whose presence in an EDH deck is usually more notable for the passive ability to shut down artifacts that enemies control. And Karn is usually famous for some really nasty combos. Here though, Karn can just resummon the artifacts that Osgir has exiled to start us back on them once again. That is the type of silliness that I just love to see. Now there are a few tweaks and tune-ups that our Artificer is aching to make, so I think this project is going to need the following 3 things. Naturally, we need a power drill, then we'll probably need to use a side grinder, and finally, we definitely need our impact driver. Let's start off with part 1 and drill down on some cards that maybe aren't pulling their weight. Osgir reminds me a little bit of my Marin of Clan Nel Toth deck. In that deck, I want basically all of my removal to be sourced on creatures, because then she can repeat them over and over and over again. And Osgir's the same way with artifacts. Here, whenever he asks, can we fix it? We want to be able to respond, yes, we can. So if we run into any of those lackluster spells, we'll just make sure that we get them cleaned up with our shop vac. We are weirdly going to end up removing some removal. I just think some of the options we've got here are a tad clunky. For instance, Rip Apart is sorcery speed to do 2 lackluster things. And it's not an artifact itself that we'd be able to repeat the effects of. I'm just slightly off on this one. I also harbor no love for Return to Dust. This card is outclassed by tons of other cards, from Wear and Tear to Crush Contraband. I don't think the flexibility on this one is very good, because the flexibility only truly exists at sorcery speed. And when our deck already contains tons of other removal unrepeatable artifacts, like Meteor Golem and the new Angel of Ruins, I just lose my love for these spells kinda fast. I will end up being a little hypocritical here and end up removing the Dispeller's Capsule though. It sounds nice to get multiple copies of this, but that 3 mana activation cost ain't it. One of the first things I learned from this deck is that it can produce a lot of mana by duplicating mana rocks, but even with that knowledge, this is too big a price to pay for a tiny effect, especially when we're able to get that ability on a lot of our other artifacts anyway. On the subject of removal, I can't help but notice we have one pair of boots, but not the other. Let's get some Swifties in here. Osgir is likely to draw some ire, but even more than that, it sounds really fun to make 2 copies of the boots too. The last thing I want to address is this here route. It's a fine card, I don't hate it, but I do want to replace it with an austere command. We have almost no enchantments in this deck, which means one of these modes is nearly always one-sided. Remember also that Osgir makes copies of the artifacts we exile, and while most tokens do not have a mana value, tokens that are exact copies of something do retain the mana value characteristic. In other words, we have some flexibility here to create tokens of big artifacts that this spell won't blow up. There's a lot of flexibility to make this a one-sided board wipe that route didn't have, so I appreciate that advanced utility. Alright, mostly what we did there was make some room for future improvements, so let's press on and bust out that side grinder. Like any grinder, we're here to scrape every bit of value that we can out of our cards. This will be a super short section, but if there are some tweaks that we can make to take us even just up by 1% or 2% efficiency, that is going to make all the difference for our machines. I only have a few tiny swaps to make here. Ruin Grinder does not impress me whatsoever. This is not an ability that I want our opponents to have the option to use. Wheels can be very dangerous, and this is not a Boros deck that is in urgent need of card draw. We have advantage in plenty of places, rendering this one less than necessary. I'd like to exchange it for one of my all-time favorite artifact deck staples, Trading Post. This helps us discard to fill the yard, it helps us sacrifice artifacts or get them back. This card is terrific. Definitely make a spot for it. The only other cut I find myself wanting to make in this section is the Gearsmith. Not because I think it's bad, I came close to keeping it to be honest, but just because I think the card Saheeli's Directive is a better fit for our deck. This is a burst of card advantage. We have so many artifacts that we're bound to hit a lot off of this spell. That's true of a ton of artifact decks, but it's especially true in this one because Osgir incidentally makes so many copies of mana rocks that our mana production is oftentimes off the dang charts. This section is all about grinding out some extra value, and this is exactly the type of spell to help us do it. Okay, that was nice and all, but let's actually give this deck some polish. Our most exciting additions await us in section 3. Okay, so I say exciting, but in truth, this final section is not going to contain a bunch of those big, wacky, splashy spells. The original precon kind of already has that ground covered, because there are tons of awesome artifacts that can overwhelm our enemies. But the true skill of Artifice lies in finesse. We made some extra room by cutting extra cards in earlier sections, so this is where we'll fill back up. But I'm gonna start this section off with our final cuts before we add in our final fun cards. Our rule in this series is that we have to keep the total price of the deck cost neutral. Sometimes there are naturally some cards that happen to be a little pricey that I don't think the deck really needs, and other times one big cut will subsidize the cost of all of our upgrades, because those upgrades are a better place to put our money than one expensive card. So far, the cards I've cut haven't been too spendy. So let's discuss a pricier card that I'm going to end up cutting and why. Let's talk about Monologue Tax. There's a lot of discussion happening around this card online. It's no Smothering Tithe, but heck, Smothering Tithe is a high bar for any card to compare itself to. Some are claiming this card to be excellent, and others have had very, very little luck with it, especially in terms of early game acceleration when opponents aren't casting many spells in a single turn. I'm not here to say that this card is bad. I'm here to acknowledge that I don't think this deck needs this card. It's an enchantment that makes artifact tokens, which is nice, but weird. And our deck here just isn't having issues with mana acceleration. I even found myself comfortable with the low land count in this deck because there are over 15 sources of mana acceleration in the deck that happily fill out the low ends of the mana curve already. As it happens, while I'm on the subject, the other card I'm tossing is Basalt Monolith. Basalt Monolith is really cute to duplicate, and there are infinite combos that it can pull off. Stick around for the honorable mentions later on to learn more. But it's been my experience that that is not what the average Osgir player is after. I still found myself fine on mana even without these, because that's just how reliable our other sources of acceleration wind up being, especially when they're so very duplicable. To circle back to the Monologue Tax, I think this is a card that will benefit other white decks. For instance, I'm really looking forward to playing it in my Thalisse deck, where I can take advantage of the fact that these are making tokens. Here, ramp on artifacts is a lot more pliable and reconstructible for us, and we happen to already be swimming in quite a lot of it. So if you got this card in the Osgir precon, I think it's a fine card to take out and to put elsewhere, because we got our mana rock game on lock already. Alright then, room has been made, so what are we adding? Well, that Mishra's Bauble sure catches my eye as a hilarious way to draw cards for no mana, especially when Osgir redoes it for free. I think Urza's Bauble is a little jealous and wants to have a brothers Bauble war to see which one can help us most. I'd also be remiss if I didn't recommend an extra turn spell here, right? Ugin's Nexus gives us an extra turn when it hits the hay. It exiles itself to do this, so if we cast it and sacrifice it right away, that might not be the kind of thing that we can duplicate. But even in that case, that's an extra turn spell in colors that don't normally get access to extra turns. Plus, if we can get it into the graveyard, say by rummaging and looting discard effects, which our deck happens to be full of, then this is a super exciting artifact to make 2 copies of. Now this is important. When making 2 copies, you have to make sure they both kick the bucket. The legend rule will take care of one of them, but make sure to leave up 1 extra mana for Osgir to sacrifice the other. If we still have 1 in play, it will negate any extra turns. That's such a small hindrance though, considering our commander is the thing that makes 2 copies of this and is the sacrifice outlet that can make sure they both die. When played from our hand, Ugin's Nexus is 6 mana for an extra turn, which opponents will not anticipate from a Boros deck. But when discarded and resurrected from the graveyard, it's a total of 6 mana for 2 extra turns, which is sure to help Osgir reconstruct not just our own artifacts, but also our enemies' life totals. Alright, now here's one of the bigger shifts that I think this deck should make. I am cutting all the plains and all the mountains. Why? Because I'm replacing them with snow plains and snow mountains. Again, why? Well, first, because there's no downside to doing this, and we technically have the budget to do it, which isn't normally true in this series. But more importantly, Arkham's Astrolabe is a trinket that Osgir would be well and truly fascinated by. This thing was so good it got banned in a bunch of other places. It's just a quick cantrip, but later on it's a 1-mana draw 2 for our commander. It's not as cheap as the baubles, but that rate is still awesome, and I personally get a kick out of playing cards in EDH that have been banned in other formats. Okay, now here's my final ad. Remember how gaga I got over Karn earlier because he can get back our exiled cards? Well, I've got another one here that makes me, Mr. Golgari all the time, actually really want to play white. Yeah, how about we include a quick little pull from Eternity here? No reason we can't repeat one of our favorite artifacts that Osgir already reconstructed. This is small, but man, what a trick to pull over on our enemies, who probably think that our biggest bad is already exiled, ne'er to be reused from the graveyard again. This is a nifty trick. Try it out. We'll wrap up real quick with some honorable mentions for lower budget and higher budget players. My lower budget recommendations are all going to be very simple, and they fit within the same basic category. There are some expensive cards in this deck, even just the top 3 most expensive cards, Anointed Procession, Wormcoil Engine, and Corkline Ironworks, total to over $100. If that's not of interest to you, that is no problem at all, because Osgir's got a whole lot of tiny artifacts he'd love to cook up more copies of. We'll call them eggs, because in some cases that's literal. Golden Egg, Sleeper Dart, Guild Globe, Alchemist's Vial, Skyscanner, and Prismatic Prism all replace themselves when they enter the battlefield and are happy targets for Osgir to refresh our hand. If you're not playing those $20 to $40 cards, don't worry about it. These are amazing role fillers. We've got tons of other game-ending cards in the deck already, even without those expensive things. So more card acceleration will save tons of money and help the deck's card velocity without breaking the bank. As for non-budget upgrades, there are obvious good stuffs to drift toward, of course. Smothering Tithe is bonkers in its treasure output, and Teferi's Protection is indeed a phenomenal card. I think the cards that least impress me from this deck's point onward may end up being the Audacious Reshapers. I quite like its wildness personally, but tune-ups inevitably lean away from chance, and there's not quite enough deck manipulation for this one to be reliably cheating 7-drops into play just yet. At least not from the average base that we have here. As for Tef Pro, I did personally noticed that Felden of the Third Path would occasionally struggle to find targets that I wasn't able to reuse or recycle in other ways already. My personal favorite recommendation, though, would be Scourglass. Toss out the Cleansing Nova if you want to try this one out. It blows away anything that isn't an artifact, which is perfect for us, and making 2 copies of it is pretty horrible for our enemies to try and fight through. Don't be surprised either if your future upgrades lead you to cut the higher cost mana producers like Burnished Heart for teeny mana rocks like Lotus Bloom, which are very enjoyable indeed for Osgir to copy for free. And depending on how efficient you want this deck to become, you can also throw that Basalt Monolith back in, because it goes infinite with other cards in the average deck, like Rings of Brighthearth, which allows you to run wild with stuff like Staff of Domination. Additionally, there's that Karn in the list, so it will not surprise me if Mycosynth Lattice becomes another go-to upgrade for Osgir decks, because this combo locks down enemy ability to do anything at all. I won't make official suggestions for these potential deck building paths though, just because it feels like these directions are taking us kinda far away from what the average Osgir player is hoping to do, but it is definitely wise to be aware of them. Artifact decks are just famous for combos, and if we try to delve into more of them, we'd probably be here all day. But just keep in mind that there's so much that you can accomplish when your commander builds things this well. For now, I'll leave you off with this final list. May it bring you joy in your mission to reconstruct the past. You can find the link in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed this expedition with Osgir, and if you have any other cool crafts that you want to share with your fellow loreholds, make sure you construct a comment down below. Thanks so much for watching.